The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. Today we'll be talking about how much of technology is designed not only to make our lives easier and more comfortable, but also to compensate for our cognitive biases. Our guest today is Ash Donaldson, Human Factors Engineer in Sydney, Australia. But first, let's go back to that comfort part and talk about repetitive stress injuries. I'm here with Paul Ingraham. Paul is known to Skeptically Speaking listeners for his legal skirmish over the right to criticize pseudoscientific practices in massage therapy and chiropractic. Now a former massage therapist, Paul quit his day job in alternative medicine a year ago to switch to full-time science writing. He now makes a living with his self-help information about pain problems at his website saveyourself.ca. He's also a volunteer editor at sciencebasedmedicine.org. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Des.
So explain to us what a repetitive stress injury is.
A repetitive strain injury, or RSI, or overuse injury is basically anything bad that happens to you in the course of doing something way too much. There's about a dozen of the common ones. If you go through them roughly in order of infamy, you've got your carpal tunnel syndrome. That's the one that everybody knows. You got your plantar fasciitis. That's pain on the bottom of the foot. You've got the two runner's knee conditions, iliotibial band syndrome, or IT band syndrome, which happens to lots of runners, and patellofemoral pain syndrome, also happens to lots of runners, but also a lot of desk workers. You've got your rotator cuff tendonitis. You've got your Achilles tendonitis, your tennis elbow. You got about 3 different kinds of shin splints, jumper's knee, that's patellar tendonitis, and finally de Quervain's tenovaginitis, which sounds kind of dirty. Those are the common RSIs.
Well, so how repetitive is repetitive? You say you do this a bunch of times, but how can one tell what is a bunch of times?
When it starts to hurt,
Right.
And repetitive is a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't necessarily have to be, a motion that you are doing over and over again, like swinging a door on its hinges over and over again. It's just any sustained strain to the tissues. And most of the ones that I list, about half, they're tendinitises. So they're the connective tissues that attach muscles to bones. They're the weak points. They're the ones that go. And sure, sometimes it happens when you do a motion over and over again, but it could also happen just by pulling on it way too long and too often. It's not necessarily a repetitive motion.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I've heard that some people who breastfeed end up with carpal tunnel as well from holding their arms in a certain way.
Exactly. You're just sustaining an awkward position. There's no particular motion that's happening over and over again, but you're sure doing something challenging for too long. All of the RSIs are basically a problem with your tissue not being able to keep up with the strain. If you put more stress into the structure than it can handle, then the cells have to scramble to constantly rebuild and maintain that tissue. And if they can't keep up, like Lucy trying to keep up with chocolates on the conveyor belt, then the tissue starts to degenerate. And that's when you get pain. So any force, anything that is hammering on the tissues and the tissues cannot repair themselves fast enough, you're going to get an RSI.
So the obvious question is, how can people avoid these kind of injuries in the first place?
Avoid anything that involves a lot of strain. Now we can jump right into some of the interesting myths about RSIs, because what people think constitutes a strain is often not really a problem. So, for instance, there's an entire industry based on the idea of reducing strain through better ergonomics or things that you put in your shoes or braces, etc. And these things do not necessarily reduce strain, and they don't necessarily do it anywhere near enough to make a difference. So let me get into the myths a little bit. There's several really surprising facts about RSIs that people don't know, and unfortunately that healthcare professionals don't know as well. So, for instance, RSIs are not inflamed. That one blows everybody's mind. RSIs are not a mechanical failure. RSIs need rest way more than they need anything else. They routinely involve muscle, and RSIs, they play head games. So let's go back through some of those a little bit. Start with the head games. This is a great example of why, the strain may not be as big a factor as people realize. Modern neuroscience is crystal clear on this point, that the chronicity of pain, how long it lasts, how stubborn it is intensely psychological, which is not to say that they are all in your head, but as with all chronic pain problems, they are affected by what's in your head. This has been shown over and over again that the things that you might think would be obvious factors, like the ergonomics of breastfeeding, may not be anywhere near as important as the psychological factors. How anxious you get about it, as one example.
Interesting.
There's some truly weird science around RSIs. It's even been shown that they occur in weird little epidemics. So as awareness of a condition like carpal tunnel syndrome sweeps through a population, suddenly you get a whole bunch of people who get it, almost like it's a virus passing through the population.
Really?
Yes, it's very odd. And it shows the power of the mind. We now know a great deal more than has been integrated into healthcare about how pain works. And we know that pain changes pain. When we start to hurt, we change the way we hurt. And this is one of the main mechanisms by which pain becomes chronic. So if you get all freaked out about your pain, then you may become far more sensitive. So your threshold goes down, and something that wouldn't have been a problem a month ago, suddenly it's a problem, and it stays being a problem. The same condition is going on, but how you handle it neurologically and how your nervous system changes in response to it becomes the defining factor of what makes it stubborn and what gives it that incredibly frustrating quality that RSIs have.
More myths, please.
I should interject here that all of this stuff will be on my website. Anyone can go to saveyourself.ca/RSI or RSIs. Both will work. That's saveyourself.ca/RSI. And there'll be all this information written down and with tons of references and so on.
Awesome.
So the big myth is inflammation. This was proven 20 years ago. They're not inflamed. It's a really compelling image. People think of body parts as, sort of overheating like a car part and getting really hot and burning out. But it's just not what actually happens. And unfortunately, the idea of inflammation has spawned countless ineffective treatments and therapies. And most of those are still in use today. So, for instance, people use NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. That's ibuprofen. Doesn't do anything. There's no fire to put out. There's no inflammation to treat with an anti-inflammatory drug. And it gets far worse than that. You have, for instance, corticosteroid injections, which are incredibly potent anti-inflammatory. And, man, if you got a fire, that's what you want to put it out with. That is a very powerful drug.
Right.
But if there's no inflammation, it doesn't do anything. And corticosteroids are infamous for their destruction of connective tissue, which is exactly what is actually wrong with tendinitis. Instead of being inflamed, basically what you have is what I call tendon rot, technically called tendinosis or tendinopathy. The cells inside the tendon that normally maintain and rebuild the connective tissue structure, the scaffolding of the tendon, those have been failing and unable to keep up with the strain, and the structure just kind of starts to slowly fall apart. And so you've got tendon that becomes all loose and disorganized. And you can actually see this. A healthy tendon looks shiny and white, and an RSI tendon looks gray. And that is because the molecular structure, right down to the molecular structure, has become disorganized. The shiny white tendon looks shiny and white because the molecules are highly organized, almost crystalline. And then when it starts to rot, you lose the evenness of the molecular structure. it loses its integrity, it is no longer as good as its job, and it looks gray. And there's absolutely no inflammation involved. So all of these assumptions for treatment and therapy that are based on the idea that the tendon is inflamed, that the structure is inflamed, when in the vast majority of cases there is literally no detectable inflammation. There's nothing going on that is like inflammation. It's not on fire.
Okay, so you've given us a bunch of stuff that doesn't work. So what does?
Above all, rest. And this is never given as much emphasis as it should be. It's very unsexy. It's very boring as a cure. And it is a real problem for people because usually it means resting from either work or play, from either something you have to do or something you love to do. And it is not pretty as a solution, but the evidence is very strong that when connective tissue has fallen behind and isn't maintaining itself, it really takes a long time to rebuild itself. And what most people end up doing, because when they go for therapy, it's either focused on treating inflammation or it's focused on treating biomechanical problems and subtle postural stresses that they might be present, but they're really not the main factor. The main factor is just that you're doing something strenuous. And all this therapy and treatment is focused on that, and the rest factor gets virtually ignored. Patients are either barely told to rest at all or not told. And so what I hear over and over and over again as a publisher of a self-help website is people say that they've rested, and what they describe is basically taking it easy for a little while, a couple weeks maybe, a month. But resting inadequately for 6 months is still resting inadequately. You have to actually stop irritating the tissue. It just doesn't stand a chance if it's still being used intensively. And so this very boring therapy is chronically neglected, and yet everybody says, oh, I've tried everything, but they've never tried rest, not really.
Well, I find effectiveness sexy.
Absolutely. And people really change their tune, of course, once they actually see it starting to work. Oh, okay, now this is good.
On your site, you wrote a post called Unconventional Ergonomics, and it was about ways to avoid these kind of injuries, ways specifically that people might not think about. Can you tell us about that?
The big problem with ergonomics is that it's way too focused on chairs.
Right.
And it's sometimes it seems like ergonomics is almost exclusively about chairs, but it's about usage. It's about efficiency overall. But as important as that is, and I really want to see every desk worker put some thought into how they can make their work more efficient and more comfortable, it's equally important to emphasize that in the case of overuse injuries, it's rarely the trump factor. When you're putting in 10, 12 hours a day typing, that's the thing. And no amount of efficiency is going to put much of a dent in that.
Is this really a, doctor, it hurts when I do this, you should stop doing that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it really is. And the reason that there's so much stuff about ergonomics and posture and biomechanics is because it gives therapists something to therapize. If it weren't for that, you take your problem to the physiotherapist. The physiotherapist has almost nothing to do if there's not a biomechanical problem to try to correct.
Right.
There's really very little justification for their existence. It just irritated a whole lot of physiotherapists listening.
Oh yes. That's all right, though. You actually had a really interesting idea because we do think constantly about ergonomics being chairs, but you actually suggest possibly using an uncomfortable chair.
Yeah, to keep you out of it.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. I have a very comfortable chair at my desk. There are days when I think this thing is dangerous. It's a lovely chair. I have absolutely no buyer's remorse. I spend a lot on it, and I'm glad of it. It's a very good chair. But the more comfortable your chair, the more likely you are to spend a bunch of time in it. So if you buy an uncomfortable chair, just make sure that you actually heed the signals and go, ow, this is uncomfortable, I'm going to get out of it. It's a stimulant to microbraking. Microbraking is a great example of what you were asking about unconventional ergonomics. The real issue being not the chair, but how often you're in it, and the stagnancy of being in it. One of the simplest and most useful things that every chair warrior can do is get up more often.
Isn't that funny that you have to say that over and over again?
Yeah, and yet not. I mean, it makes complete sense. Here's another great example of something people say, well, I do that. I've tried everything. But when you dig, you find out that they're just going to the printer. They get up out of their chair and they go to the water cooler. That's not really much of a stimulation for your body. It's better than being down. I'm never going to knock it. I'm never going to say, don't do that. That's not good. But when you get out of the chair, you need to do a few things with your body that are that directly counteract the stagnancy. So, bend down and touch your toes a few times. You need to actually use the tissues that have been so stagnant in the chair, as opposed to merely getting up and going and grabbing something from the printer.
Tough talk from Paul Ingraham.
Yeah. Bully.
So if people go to your site, can they find information like this? And what other pain problems do you talk about?
Save Yourself focuses on a few of the repetitive strain injuries and then a few other things. For instance, low back pain, which kind of bridges the gap. Low back pain is often thought of as an RSI, but that's also usually kind of misguided. It's based on the incorrect notion that the back is a fragile structure that wears out and breaks down easily, which it really does not. So I have extensive tutorials on several topics, and in the RSI category, I cover IT band syndrome, plantar fasciitis, patellofemoral pain. Then there's also neck pain and back pain, and how good am I at listing them all? As good as
pain, lots of pain,
lots of pain. The focus is on pain problems and on helping both patients and professionals in a very jargon-free environment.
I can second that, absolutely. There is very little jargon on your site.
As user-friendly as possible.
Perfect. Thanks for being here, Paul, again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we'll be right back with Ash Donaldson, Human Factors Engineer, after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. You can email your questions for next week's episode to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, we're at Skeptical Radio, or use our handy question submission box on the website at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also subscribe to the show in iTunes or listen to past episodes, and while you're there, why not add your review? Skeptically Speaking is rebroadcast on a number of fine radio stations. Check the media page at skepticallyspeaking.com to see if we air near you. And now, back to the show.
I'm here with Ash Donaldson, Human Factors Engineer. For more than 14 years, Ash has been practicing, promoting, and studying all aspects of human-centered design. He served as Australia's first federal court expert witness in human-computer interaction and contributed to the international standards and Australian standards for human factors accessibility and usability. He's currently consulting as principal of his company, Produxy Consulting, designing better user experiences. Welcome to Skeptically Speaking, Ash.
Thank you, Desiree.
So, human factors engineering. Now, I know what all those words mean individually, but it sounds like it should be obvious what they mean when you put them together, but it's not quite. Can you give us a bit of a definition?
Human factors is basically the applied science of optimizing human performance and safety. It's about understanding human strengths and limitations and applying that when designing products and services or organizations or even environments.
But isn't this something that humans have been doing basically forever? I'm thinking specifically about making stones into tools by shaping them to make them easier to hold. So when did this become a formal discipline?
It actually came out of aviation, which is my background. I was originally a pilot. Back in the late 30s, I think, Alexander Williams Jr., he was studying stress of pilots in flight. And from there, it kind of evolved very quickly. In the 40s, just as the war was starting, there was a lot of appearances in training and combat reports of the terms pilot error. And some of the psychologists that were working in the area thought, these are becoming more and more frequent, so perhaps it's not the pilots that error, perhaps it's the design. Probably the recognised father of human factors was a fellow by the name of Alphonse Chapanis. In 1943, he was asked to discover why pilots kept on retracting the wheels after landing. Pilots would land their aircraft and then just go belly up. So he had a look across all the aircraft that this was happening on. It was P-47s, B-17s, B-25s. So he had a look at the design of all these aircraft. He actually sat with pilots and watched how they did things. And it turned out that just during the landing and takeoff phases, that's when pilots become a bit more stressed. When you become more stressed, your ability to problem solve reduces significantly. So he noticed in the P-47s, B-17s and B-25s, the flaps and gear controls were side by side, and they were indistinguishable from each other. So the pilot would land and think he's retracting the flaps when he was indeed retracting the gears. And so he just made a slight change to this and changed the flaps control to look and feel like a flap, so it was a smooth wedge. And he changed the gears controls to look and feel like a round rubber wheel. And that design is carried on in all aircraft today.
Superficially, this field sounds like ergonomics, but it's much, much broader than that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the term ergonomics is used synonymously for human factors. Ergonomics is the European version of it, the meaning of which is the laws of work. In the United States and Australia, ergonomics is normally to do with optimizing the machine design for human operation. And yes, human factors looks at the wider systems as well. So it also looks at selection, training, and organization. So producing people who get the best performance possible within machine design limitations.
So what kind of scientific disciplines then would you wind up drawing from?
Human factors itself is an applied science, but it draws on a number of different disciplines, including psychology, engineering, industrial design, statistics, social science, biomechanics, and anthropometry. So it draws on quite a number of different types of disciplines.
So maybe give me some examples of how research from those fields would be used in your field.
If I'm working on, say, an IT system, I'll go out and do some research, or actually sometimes employ some social science researchers to do it for me. They'll come back with findings of how people are currently performing a task. I'll then work with some engineers who actually have to do the technical component of actually building the system, at the same time as I'm working with designers who look at the overarching architecture of everything.
So what are some of the projects that you've worked on?
A lot of different types of projects. One of the last jobs that I was working on was in a consultative role, just helping a financial institute upskill in this area. A lot of people currently design products in a standardized way. They follow a methodology without having any visibility of the bigger picture of things. And so when I was brought in there, I helped them design a lab where they could prototype and test all their types of systems. And I actually helped them design a number of projects, anything from the design of their new ATMs through to how they actually go through a sales process of credit cards in a branch. Yeah, it was a rather large gamut of different things. But the underlying principles remain the same across all.
And would you say that underlying principle is basically usability then?
Usability is a component of this. But if you look at something like a video game is actually designed to be frustrating to a point. If you applied usability to it, it would be very easy to use, and it wouldn't really achieve the goal you wanted to achieve. It's actually understanding what the goal of the system is, understanding the strengths and limitations of the people that you're designing for, and then designing that system to achieve the goals.
Well, I was looking on the Usability Conference, I believe it is, website.
Yes.
And there's a student video on the most recent conference, and it's called Why Buttons Go Bad. It's about buttons going from something that was made to hold your pants up to being used for everything from elevators to typewriters to technology. So the video points out that where technology is concerned, there's almost a conflict between the engineers and the designers. So the engineers are focused on function and the designers are worried about aesthetics. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I think both of them, because they don't have visibility of each other typically on a product design or a service design, what generally does happen is a designer will work on something and then pass it on to the engineer, who then has to interpret some specifications or something like that. And the engineer is concerned with making things efficient technically. The designer is concerned with making things aesthetic. There's typically no one sitting above them to make sure that the whole system reaches the goals of the user. And that's where someone like myself comes in.
So would human factors engineers act as also sort of a stand-in for the consumer?
We are often known as consumer advocates or user advocates, but I think we're more like product owners. We're more like the person that sees over everything. The consumer advocate is just one of those functions.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm here with Ash Donaldson, human factors engineer. I was surprised by just how much mental workflow is really a central aspect of your field, because we're not just talking about making a keyboard or a mouse easier to use, but it's also about making software more intuitive. And something I found interesting was the way that software uses metaphor, real-world symbols and processes that interact with the software, like images of folders or music playlists. Can you explain how that works?
It's basically about matching a user's mental models of how things work. And funnily enough, most people don't understand how most things work. We muddle through life. As long as our knowledge is good enough, that will keep us going. We don't modify that knowledge. So if you ask an electrical engineer how the cooling thermostat on a refrigerator works, they'll be able to tell you that if you turn the dial in the fridge to make the fridge colder, it will actually make the freezer less cold, because it's just a one-way valve, even though there's a knob in both the freezer and the fridge. A housewife, however, or a house husband, may not know that there is only one valve. Since there's two knobs, they'll turn both to as cold as possible and wonder why it's not changing the thermostat in there. So actually researching with people who are going to use a system and understanding how they perceive the world, how they form their mental models and what errors they have in how things work really helps to inform the design of systems. And you can bring real-world systems into intangible systems. So you were saying the desktop of a computer uses metaphors for the desktop that you sit and work with. In the beginning, it was useful for people who didn't understand computers, were frightened by computers, just to have something that they could associate with, that files lived in folders, that if I want to delete something, I can put it into a trash bin. It gives those real-world affordances for them. Personally, I think this is a bit of an outdated metaphor, because it was good when it all started off, but we need to start progressing away from these things now, and that's where you see things like Apple's iPad is starting to change that metaphor. It's no longer a desktop, you no longer have a rubbish bin on it. They're starting to migrate away from those things.
Well, that's interesting, because I use a certain brand of computer that I won't name, or else I'll sound like one of those people. But when I started using it, I did notice immediately that with my old computer, I had to use the help menu and internet forums to figure out where certain functions were located. But with the new one, I just basically go to the menu that I think it's most likely to be in, and it's usually there. So how do you guys figure that out, where a user is most likely to look for something?
That's the difference between an engineering-centric company and a user-centric company. If you have a whole lot of engineers working on an issue, they're looking down at the technical specifications, whereas if you have a whole lot of designers working in human factors looking at an issue, they'll start with understanding how the users perceive the world, and then they'll build a prototype and test that prototype with them to make sure that they're going down the right track. So at the end of the day, when you or I get to use that software, it just seems intuitive to use.
Well, I appreciate it. I have a question from James T. I was thinking about the Wii and now the Kinect system for the Xbox 360. starting with the Wii controller that works based on human motion and then moving to the Kinect system that eliminates the controller and just reads the motion right from the body, and the fact that people are starting to hack the Kinect system to do all sorts of things beside playing games, how far are we away from the interface in Minority Report?
The interface in Minority Report was actually based on an interface that already exists. The only problem with such a system is it fatigues you. It looks so fancy and so good. It's cool, but for practicality, you wouldn't be able to do more than a few minutes work at a time on it. If you've ever tried holding your arms out in front of you for an extended period of time, you'll find that the small muscles in your shoulders very quickly fatigue. If you had to spend all day working on something where you're waving your arms in front of you, that wouldn't work out too well.
So this is where the engineer comes up against the designer.
Exactly.
So what else is going on in tech then that you particularly like from a human factors perspective?
I'm currently doing some work with brain-computer interface. It can actually pick up on discrete cognitive patterns. So if you think left, you can move something left. It takes a bit of training of both the computer and the user, but eventually you can actually have it working to some form of reliability. Unfortunately, our minds scatter all over the place. So to actually control a system using brain-computer interface probably isn't the best unless, say, you're disabled in a wheelchair. If you're a paraplegic, it would be very good for controlling, say, turning on the lights of your house or moving your wheelchair without having to use something like a blow and suck interface, which a lot of people do, or a chin interface.
Right.
Currently, I'm working on a system that will allow me to pick up when people are confused, when they're engaged, when they're focused, while they're playing with the system, which is very useful for evaluating the design of the system.
So you don't just go with sort of self-reported evaluation then. You would actually have an outside test that would assess that.
Well, self-report, unfortunately, is invariably almost always wrong. There's so many biases that come in when you ask someone, how do you do this? What did you feel about doing this? Our brains don't work the way most people think they do. And so when people think back on how they did something, first of all, they're affected by a bias, whether it's trying to please the interviewer or trying to look like they know what they're doing, or their memory actually drops what they did and confabulates or makes up how they actually behaved. Which is why in any of our research, what we've got to do is triangulate the data. We've got to get more than one data point and work off that. And if you can get physiological data points, that's a good objective measure.
One of the ways that mental processes are integrated into design is in trying to make things like flying safer, as you brought up before. Now, you gave a great example in your talk at TED Canberra about how instrument flying can conflict with a pilot's senses in a really scary way.
Back in the early 90s, when I was a training commercial pilot, I thought I was a pretty good pilot because I got a lot of good scores on tests and got selected for a number of things. And so I had quite a bit of confidence in my flying. One day I was asked if I wanted to start my instrument flying training. Now, the difference between visual flying and instrument flying is visual flying, you're only allowed to fly when you can see to a certain extent. So you have to be able to see 10 miles into the distance. You have to be able to see the ground below you. Whenever it gets a bit too cloudy for that, or at night, you have to start working off instruments. So instrument flying is more for the more professional pilots, and visual flying is for the weekend or rookie pilots. And so anyway, I was taken by my flight instructor, Bob, took me out to the southern training area and put a plastic hood over my eyes, which constrained my view from being able to see outside to only my 6 instruments in front of me. He said, "Radio Ash, we're going to go for a bit of a fly here. I want you to maintain straight and level flying." And so I did that for a while. And he said, "Oh, well, You did well at that. You didn't drift off or anything. You maintained heading, so that's really good. And so he said, now I want you to do a standard rate turn. It was a bit trickier. I had to balance the ball and slip and keep my turn going at a certain pace. But I managed it until Bob said, can you just go back out to straight and level? So I turned back out to straight and level, but then I noticed that my artificial horizon wasn't quite straight. So I dipped my right wing slightly, and then I looked across to my turn and slip indicator. That seemed a little bit out as well, so I kicked in some rudder. Then my directional gyro started turning, my altimeter was rising, the artificial horizon was starting to slip off the gauge. My instruments were basically going haywire, but I knew I was flying straight and level. And then Bob whipped the hood off me. When he whipped the hood off, I basically saw I was upside down in a spiral. And I'd entered what's known as the graveyard spiral. And in a recent study, the average pilot with no instrument flight training who enters clouds lasts a mere 178 seconds before they spiral to their death. My vestibular sense, the sense that tells me which way my body is oriented, which way is up, like all senses, it can be misleading at times. I was following that sense and it was wrong instead of following the evidence in front of me. And so I thought, okay, I've been fooled once, I won't get fooled again. But I was the next time I went up, and the next time, and the next time. It took me about 6 goes to be able to trust my instruments, even when I knew that the instruments were always right. I was so sure in myself that my instruments were wrong because my body was telling me differently. And that's where you have that conflict of intuition versus evidence. And that's what led me into really digging human factors. I really thought that this was a cool area because it's so easy to get fooled by things and be so sure that you're right, even in the face of all evidence.
So really then, does human factors engineering have 2 main goals? You know, the first one to figure out what humans will naturally do and to try and accommodate for that. But as a secondary goal, to also determine when people's natural inclinations are dangerous and then to develop strategies to compensate for that.
Definitely. And I mean, it's the applied science of optimizing human performance and safety. It's knowing where people will make errors and what kind of errors they'll make and accounting for that. Back in the day, there was a guy called James Reason, and he did the seminal work on errors called human error. Basically, he split errors out into a number of different types. So there were slips, lapses, mistakes, and violations. A slip is where an action is not carried out as intended or planned. So if you're tuning your radio dial, for those people who still use dials and still use radios, and you turn the dial too far, then that would be a slip. A lapse is missing an action or an omission of an action. So if we go back to being a pilot, on final approach you have a number of things to go through on your checklist. Now, if you forgot to lower your landing gear, that would be a lapse. There's mistakes, which is basically an error caused by a flawed understanding of the issue. So what we were talking about before with people have a mental model of the world, and that mental model of the world is usually just enough to muddle through, but it often doesn't reflect reality. So if you have a flawed understanding of an issue and you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not, you're making a mistake. And then the last one is a violation. So that's knowingly going against the rules. That's an error where you know you're making a mistake, but you're going to do it anyway because you think that that is the right thing to do. A machine will go by logic in every situation. A human can override that logic as well. So, and it can have consequences either way. So you might be standing at a set of traffic lights waiting for the pedestrian sign, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning, there's no cars coming. So you might decide to violate the rule and walk across the road without waiting for the signal. That is a practical thing to do if you want to get home and it's a bad place that you're in and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It can be a bad thing if a car comes flying by just at that point in time. So, Reason classified these types of errors and created a foundation for understanding where people will make mistakes.
So what are some of the other ways, the specific ways that our brain fools us, that human factors engineering tries to account for?
Have you got all day? The list of cognitive biases that we fall prey to is extensive, I must say. It can be anything from confirmation bias, when we have an idea of something and we only search for or interpret information that confirms our beliefs and discard or minimise or trivialise any evidence to the contrary. You have things like loss aversion, where people don't look at utility. If they own something, they will lose a lot of money or lose a lot of time or lose relationships over losing that thing, over giving it away. You have selective perception, so that's where tendencies actually affect perception. You have an expectation to see something, and so you see it. A good example of that is when you're training to be a pilot. If you have to find an aircraft in the sky, they actually get you to break the sky up into quadrants and scan each of those quadrants. Because when you look up in the sky, you expect to see blue. And if you expect to see blue, that's all your brain will see. You have to actually go over each of those quadrants because your eyes only dart about in very small saccades. You don't actually see everything that's in front of you. So one of those saccades has actually got to land on an aircraft. And so we're taught to break up into quadrants, have a look in each of those quadrants, scan each of those quadrants of the sky until you see the aircraft that's just been mentioned to you.
Well, I have an audience question on this topic. It's from Al Morrison. It seems we need a specific set of techniques to recognize and short-circuit those cognitive biases which hamper rational, critical thinking. Simply recognizing that we have cognitive biases is not enough. Are there specific techniques? Are they simple enough to be adopted in our everyday lives?
I think I would have to disagree with that. I think we're at a level of maturity that's one step back from that. Most people aren't aware that they're affected by these biases in the first place. There's actually a bias that affects that as well. It's called bias blind spot. We see ourselves as less biased than other people. That's just how our brain works. So we see that, yes, biases will affect other people, but they don't affect me so much. And I actually think that if people are taught early on how the mind actually works and the types of biases that affect us, then we can start to make progress. Are there ways to get around these biases? Yes, there are. It's called the scientific method. And it's not just a method for scientists. It's a framework that can work for all levels of discourse. And I think that if people were made aware of the type of biases they fall prey to, if they were made aware of how their mind works, then people would have a far greater appreciation for the scientific method and how its goal is to mitigate as many of those biases as possible.
So can you give us an example of a specific design or program that's actually made to account specifically for those kinds of things?
A piece of equipment was created not too long ago because a lot of people were dying in hospitals. Now, this was a multifactorial problem, which meant basically there were problems compounding upon problems. Now, nurses and doctors in hospitals, in Australia especially, and Canada and the USA, are sometimes worked way beyond their capacity. It's not unheard of for people to have 72-hour shifts, which is just mind-blowing considering we can't really concentrate for more than a few hours at a time. And if you're kept awake for a very long time, then that has serious implications on problem-solving abilities, down to simple motor skills as well. And one of the studies found that a lot of people were dying of morphine overdoses. And this just came down to nurses that were working way too many hours, and they had a simple thumb dial. Now, they were supposed to roll on, say, 10 milligrams of morphine per hour. And because it was a thumb dial, it was very easy to not get the second number from 0 to 1, but slip and get the third number from 0 to 1. Now, their training says that they should check this and, say, double-check it with someone else. Unfortunately, in the heat of the moment and when you haven't slept for a few days and all the doctors are busy and all the other nurses are busy, people don't check these things. So, the slip of the thumb compounded with a lack of sleep, compounded with the problem of a lack of availability of someone else, meant that people would key in the wrong thing. So this was mitigated by changing the design of it to something that had to be typed in and couldn't be executed until someone double-checked it, instead of using a rotating thumb dial.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm talking with Ash Donaldson, Human Factors Engineer. We'll be right back with more after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we're joined by researcher and science writer Cheryl Kirschenbaum to talk about her book, The Science of Kissing. We'll learn about the surprisingly complex chemistry that's going on during a passing peck or a passionate lip lock. And Greg Layden returns for another edition of Everything You Know Is Sort of Wrong. Are there really universal traits that appear across all human cultures? Find out next week on Skeptically Speaking, Friday night at 6 Mountain Time, live at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm here with Ash Donaldson, and we're talking about a discipline that applies what we know about human capabilities and limitations to the design of products, processes, systems, and work environments. Human Factors Engineering. So let's start with a question from the audience. I have a question from Ryan. I've tried one of the split ergonomically correct keyboards. It was horrible. If it's supposed to be better for you, why is it so uncomfortable?
This is physical ergonomics, which is rather distinct from organisational or cognitive ergonomics. But in physical ergonomics, ergonomic keyboards, there can be a number of different factors involved here. If you're used to a keyboard that is in a straight line, then splitting the keyboard and actually have the keys sit where your hands most comfortably sit in their natural prone position is going to take a bit of getting used to. And some people give up very quickly. And that's a factor of our very fast-paced lives now. If something isn't immediately intuitive, people will give up on it. And something like this actually requires a little extra getting used to. There's also the point that so many of us type these days, yet touch typing, when I was growing up, touch typing was something that I never learned, so I hunt and peck at 60 words per minute. Hunting and pecking doesn't really work with an ergonomic keyboard because an ergonomic keyboard has been designed around someone who rests their fingers on the home keys.
Right.
I don't do that, and the listener may also not do that. Or if they do it, then perhaps they should give themselves, say, a couple of months of using it to get used to it. But be aware, as soon as you have to use someone else's computer, then that's going to feel horrible too. Probably the best rule of thumb is go for the de facto standard. If it's something ubiquitous like a keyboard, I would always stick with a non-ergonomic keyboard unless you are, say, a data operator that has to use one 24 hours a day. If you swap from keyboard to keyboard, you're better off using a straight line one.
So now this is the thing. If part of human factors engineering is about usability, if it's a component of it, then doesn't the fact that the user is uncomfortable or takes a while to get used to that new keyboard, they probably won't use it, and it kind of defeats the purpose?
Yes.
Okay.
To a point. The definition of usability is specified users. So you specify your group of users. I'm saying we're going to target data operators working in a call center with lighting of this and ambient noise of this and this type of equipment, working toward a specified set of goals. You've got to take all these things into account when you're actually designing something to be usable. The more generic you design something, the less usable in general it may be.
Well, let's just talk about examples of purely bad design. Now, I once had a cell phone that was lovely, very aesthetically pleasing, except for the fact that when I used it, the button to hang up the call was located precisely where my chin was, which is not handy, really. Now, I'm assuming you hear stories like that all the time.
That's why I have a never-ending stream of work. And that usually comes down to something like engineering-based design. So what can happen is a group is given a specified time to finish a project by, and they will have a list of features in a specification, and they will design for all of those features. Now, engineers will make sure it's technically efficient, but when it comes to someone actually using the product, it could have a negative implication, like the hang-up button being where the chin hits, because they never took that and tested it with people.
Well, what are your horror stories, sir? Tell me horrible things. Tell me horrible design stories.
I can just tell you one horrible design story that covers many, 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 and it's the design of corporations. How products get designed these days is often a reflection of how a company is structured. And if you have a company that uses a corporate structure of, we have designers in one area and we have engineers in another area and we have product managers in another area, and all of them have their own key performance indicators that they've got to meet, and never the twain shall meet, then you always end up with a product which is a mishmash of different ideas that doesn't really suit the end user. And this is where I keep getting my work, just because people are basing their company structures and company cultures on the assembly line. Each person throws something over the fence, and at every step of the way, compromises have to be made without referring back to the person that threw the specification over the fence in the first place. And so you have the wrong compromises being made, the wrong decisions being made, and things being designed poorly, basically.
Well, since we're already talking about bad things, let's continue. A question from Chris. Desiree posted a video a while ago about the progress bar that's displayed when you're downloading a file, and how its movement can be made to trick us into thinking that it's downloading faster than it is. How much of human factors engineering is directed towards marketing and manipulation?
I don't think I've ever come across someone who calls themselves a human factors engineer in the area of marketing or manipulation. People coming from different disciplines, whether they're coming from graphic design or marketing or software engineers, and calling themselves user experience designers or service designers or design thinkers these days. And they start looking at research from the likes of Steve Martin and Robert Cialdini. So these guys, I think they wrote a book, The Science of Persuasion.
Right.
And that's compliance psychology. That's something that can be used for good or evil. And so people that have come in later on without any of the human factors background aren't really concerned more about safety and efficiency. They're more concerned about commercialization of products and services. And so they're starting to see how they can persuade people to use their products more or buy their products more. So the answer is yes, people are doing it.
Right.
But they generally don't call themselves human factors engineers. Human factors engineers are more about safety science, whereas your user experience designers, your service designers, your design thinkers, they're more interested in the persuasion side of things.
So maybe give me an example of what that kind of consumer manipulation would look like, basically so that when I see it, I can feel pleased with myself.
We'll say a pain relief tablet. A really, really simple thing is getting people to empathize with something. So instead of using an image of a person with a grimace on their face, they might use a section of a person. So they might look at the back and neck of someone who could be male or female, and that person is grabbing, say, around their shoulder, and there's red radiating out from that. Because it's not male or female, it's something that males and females can associate with. it's also something that you can put yourself in their shoes, because you've had pain in your neck or shoulder before, and it does feel like, there's heat radiating out from it. And so you've empathised with that, which means you're locked into that straight away. So that's a form of compliance. And another great one, if you walk through any crowded city, walk through one of the main streets, you'll always have people that want you to subscribe to some kind of charity. And you'll see the better ones these days, they don't just say, excuse me, they try and get your eye contact by moving their hand off to the side. They'll make a movement, because when our eyes scan things, they actually dart around really quickly, and they zoom in on any movement. So if someone moves their hand over here, and it's just in the periphery of your vision, you'll look at that person, or you'll look at their hand. Then, because it's a person, you'll immediately look to their eyes. Once you lock eyes with them, then they can say, excuse me, and you're locked in by social norms to actually respond to them.
Oh, that is fascinating and vaguely creepy. Since we're on the vaguely creepy theme, the Department of Homeland Security has a human factors division. So
yes.
What kinds of things do they do there?
Well, I can't really speak for Homeland Security, but the man that I was speaking about before, James Reason, he became very famous for classifying and codifying types of errors, and also became very famous for some models that he created. And one of the models that is used to look at where things may go wrong is his Swiss cheese model. If you think of a whole heap of pieces of cheese, and they're all Swiss cheese, so they've got little holes in them, they can be thought of as layers of security. Every layer of security will have some weaknesses in it. And what people can do is model what those weaknesses are. And if you think of those slices of cheese all lined up side to side and moving slowly in different directions, eventually you'll be able to look through one of those holes and all the holes will line up,
right,
and you can step straight through that. So it's very good for modelling where someone will take advantage of multiple or compounding weaknesses in a security system.
So then how would human factors engineering fit in there?
Well, they would, first of all, assess all the different layers of security, assess where those weaknesses are, and then see where people might be able to take advantage of compounded problems in security and be able to actually step in and create a mitigating system for it.
How would you take that on?
I think that would be something that would be a little large for one person to take on, because it's a very sensitive area and things have just been on a reactive scale so far. I would be hesitant to make any comment, because I can't make too much of an informed comment on this.
You do realize that this is not my country or your country that we're talking about.
No, I realise this, but I do fly to America quite often, and my passport says I travel a lot.
Oh, I see where this is going.
And I'm always the guy pulled out to the side.
Thanks for being on the show, Ash. And I hope you don't get into trouble at customs next time.
Yes, my pleasure. Thanks for speaking with me, Desiree.
And where can people find you online?
They can find me at uxash.wordpress.com.
We've included that link on the show notes for this episode at skepticallyspeaking.com. There are also links to Facebook, to Twitter, and to iTunes, where you can listen to archived episodes, subscribe to the show, or write a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov's bells. Cause we're skeptically speaking, our mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon-bending mind tricks. All the humbug, flim-flam, frauds and shams, the charlatan who I don't think you understand. It's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor, leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter, your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is, cause we're skeptically speaking.